Welcome back, everyone. Hope you got your coffee, your tea, your water. We are officially kicking off the 2022 summit with our opening plenary on a very interesting, cutting-edge, relevant topic, the use of artificial intelligence and how it pertains to our relationship with animals. Are you ready to have your mind expanded, maybe even blown? One of our goals at Humane Canada Summit for Animals is to bring you new, interesting, and thought-provoking content, and this session promises to fill all of those goals. Let's start by seeing if you want to answer a yes or no in the chat to this question. Have you ever seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, on Netflix? I watched it with my son, and I got to say, it left me a little concerned about technology and about social networking and about the impacts that it has on us, but it also gave us a lot to talk about. And I'm so pleased to say that our speaker, Aza Raskin, was not only the subject, but also the architect, or one of the subjects and the architect of this Emmy Award-winning documentary. He's also the co-founder for the Center for Humane Technology and is the co-host of a popular podcast called Your Undivided Attention. Aza is a co-chairing member of the World Economic Forum's Global AI Council. He helped found Mozilla Labs and was listed on Forbes and Inc. magazine's 30 Under 30. In 2017, he founded Earth Species Project with Britt Selvatel, who was also on the founding team at Twitter. I only recently learned about the Earth Species Project, and my curiosity was piqued. This is a collective of amazing people dedicated to decoding non-human language. They believe that an understanding of non-human languages will change our ecological impact on this planet. Basically, artificial intelligence can now generate shapes that represent entire languages in a geometric structure, which can then be used to translate languages without dictionaries or without examples of translation. I do not understand it, and that's why I'm so glad that Aza's here, because it is so fascinating. The Earth Species Project is using this method basically to decode what animals are actually saying. Which, of course, if this is successful, it really reminds me of the now famous moment when Dr. Jane Goodall was researching chimpanzees at Gombe Stream in Tanzania back in the 60s. And she was able to record chimpanzees using tools, which at that time was considered the differentiating factor between what it meant to be a human and what it meant to be an animal. And so when she reports this to Dr. Leakey, he responds, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human." The work of the Earth Species Project definitely has that potential for us to need to redefine our relationship to all other animals that we share this planet with. And in fact, I believe could lead us to have to redefine what it means to be human. Before I bring Aza on stage, I'd like to ask you to refrain from posting your wonderful questions in the chat, and instead I invite you to post them over in the Q&A section, which is located at the top right-hand corner of your screen. You can use the upward arrow to upvote other questions if you want them to be at the top. All questions are anonymous, and we will try to get through as many as possible at the end of Aza's presentation. Welcome, Aza. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you so very much, Barbara. It is a true pleasure and privilege to be here and to speak to all of you out there on the other sides of screens. I think technology at its best can be used to extend the things that we humans are, that make us most human. Things like, a paintbrush or a cello are like the best forms of technology. And I think there's this real opportunity for some of the latest technology to really help us as humans learn how to listen better to the world around us. And, its great hope is that it can teach us that we are a part of nature, not apart from nature. Although as technology continues to increase, like that schism may appear larger. So I would love to just walk people through a little bit of what we're working on and why. That was an incredibly gracious introduction. Um, and yeah, I'll get going. I want to start. Uh, this is a weird looking picture, I know, but and I'll explain a little bit about like why I chose this image. But I thought I'd start with just three stories from the animal world that I find really beautiful and surprising. So the first is the primrose flower. So there was a study done in 2019 at the University of Tel Aviv. They're asking this really interesting question. They're like, nature abhors a vacuum. Do you think flowers use the sound of approaching pollinators to do something? And so they tested, they took a primrose and they played different sounds to that primrose flower. They played traffic noise, and they played bat noise, and they played the sounds of a bee. And what they discovered is that when they played the sound of an approaching pollinator, the flower started to produce more and sweeter nectar within 3 seconds. And that's pretty incredible because we don't normally think of plants having the ability to listen, and yet that's exactly what the primrose flower does. It hears the sound of approaching bee and it gets excited. And it just shows that the world is sort of awash in signals and meanings and the ability to listen that we are just completely unaware of. Um, a second study, and this came to me originally um, uh, via, let's see, it was a 1994 unpublished thesis, and from the University of Hawaii, and it was actually recreating some earlier experiments from like Lou Herman. And it was this: they asked dolphins, or they taught dolphins two gestures. One gesture was do something you had never done before. And what's amazing is that we're able to communicate the concept of innovative, do something that you haven't done before, to remember all the things that you've done in a session and do not one of those, but something new. Um, and it turns out that dolphins can do it. And they'll do something they haven't done that session for the first time after being asked. And then they would teach the dolphins another gesture: do something you haven't done before together. And the dolphins would go down and exchange sonic information and come out and do the same thing, the same trick they hadn't done before at the same time. And it's another one of those examples of just, it doesn't prove anything, but it certainly makes you wonder what kind of rich representation these dolphins are passing back and forth to be able to communicate and come out and do the same thing they hadn't done before that session at the same time. And the third one that I'll just bring up now is a theory that we have been told by some scientists around sperm whale. And this is not the consensus theory, but I bring it up because it just sort of expands or opens the aperture of the mind for when we say animal communication, animal language, like what kinds of things might we discover and how different might it be than human language? And with sperm whale, and dolphins and a number of the other of the toothed whales, they have equal spaced tooths of all the same size, which is very unusual. Looks sort of like a antenna. And when sperm whale communicate, sometimes they sort of lock heads and they're going click, 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 sending back these sort of what could be modem-like packets back and forth. And because they see as 3D sound, when they ping you with sonar, right? Not only does your body heat up, and after half an hour, you're sort of like, you're too warm, you have to get out. But they see, where your organs are. They see how much you've eaten. They see your skeletal structure. They're getting a full 3D model back that maybe because they hear as 3D sound, maybe they speak as sort of a 3D sound image, and are just passing back and forth. Like, oh, I just saw an orca. Let me beam that over to you. And again, this is not like the thing that most scientists think is happening, but I love it as a concept because it says maybe they're bypassing representational language and just going direct to sort of like 3D sound image. And that's the scope that we need to be looking at to make sure we're not just falling into what do we think language is from the human perspective. The trick about this photo is this is actually image is an AI generated image that I created using a new thing called clip guided image diffusion. I just typed in words for primrose flower with a human ear by Ernst Haeckel, and it generated this image for me. And I will come back to that too in a second. So, Earth Species Project, a little more specifically, got started. The idea originally was from 2013. And I was listening to an NPR piece on gelada monkeys that have, they're these incredible animals that live in the Ethiopian highlands, and they have, the scientist was saying like the largest vocabulary of any primate except for humans. They sound like children or women sort of babbling, and the researchers swear that the animals are talking about them, gossiping about them behind their back. And the thought was, well, could we put out like a whole bunch of microphones, microphone array, and use machine learning to decode what they're saying instead of using sort of hand recorders and hand transcribing? And the answer was, well, machine learning really at that point couldn't do that, because machines were good at, if you gave it things that you already knew, it could learn how to do more of that, but it couldn't do something as advanced as translating a language that you didn't already know the translation of. In 2017, that changed, and that's when Earth Species starting to get born. And I just want to say that I'm the person here speaking to you today, but there is an entire team of us working with I have my co-founders Katie Zakarian and Britt Selvatel. We have an incredible AI team spread, from Taiwan to Berlin to New York, all over the world. It's often, I think, easy to confuse like the person who's up on the screen with the person who's doing all of the work, but it's really, we think of ourselves as an open source collaborative to solve this problem. More than 8 million species share our planet, and we only stand the language of one. Like, this is a little bit of the why. We believe that understanding our planet helps us fight for it, and that understanding our species arms us to protect both them and us. And, sort of Barb was saying, that we think, understanding non-human languages opens up the next frontier, that the image in our mind is often that maybe as we try to decide or figure out whether humans are alone, we're pointing our telescopes the wrong direction and pointing them out into the universe, versus like in our oceans and in our backyards, where we already know there are beings with brains 3 times larger than us, that we just haven't figured out how to talk to. All right. But I said in 2017, something happened that changed about whether computers could translate languages, even if you didn't already know the translation, right? The question is, how do you translate a language without a Rosetta Stone? So the breakthrough in 2017, there are actually 2 papers that came out back to back in the way these things go, that let you take a language and turn it into a shape that represents that language. And points that mean similar things. So imagine sort of a galaxy where every star is a word. And points that mean similar things, words that are similar, are near each other. And then semantic relationships are turned into geometric relationships in this shape. And actually, the shape you're looking on screen is a representation of English, the top 10,000 most spoken words. Okay, so but what does that mean? What does it mean to turn semantic relationships into geometric relationships? Well, let me give an example. So, analogy: king is to man as woman is to queen. That means king in this shape is the same distance and direction to man as woman is to queen. And you can sort of see it here on screen. That man and king and woman and queen share a geometric relationship in the shape because they share a semantic relationship in language. And this means you can do, it's really sort of fun, vector arithmetic to do analogies. So king minus man is sort of the relationship of regalityness, and you add it to say woman and equals queen, but you add regalityness to girl and it'll equal princess, and to boy and it'll equal prince. The first thing I tried when I got my hands on this data set was like, okay, hipster minus authenticity plus conservative, and the computer just spat out electability, which is sort of terrifying when a computer can write better jokes than you can. Let me give you some more examples. All right, so smelly to malodorous, that's a relationship, right? And that's sort of the relationship of pretentiousness, if you will, because malodorous is the smelly, or is the pretentious way of saying smelly. So if you add that relationship to book, it equals tome. If you add that relationship to clever, it equals adroit. Semantic relationship becoming geometric relationship. And this works across huge numbers of actually sort of every kind of relationship. So here you can see the relationship between Tokyo and Japan is shared between Nairobi and Kenya. So you add Japan minus Tokyo plus Nairobi equals Kenya. And here's how to think about it. Dog has a relationship to man, and dog has a relationship to woman, and dog has a relationship to cat, and dog has a relationship to wolf, and to howl, and to fur, and to tail. It has all these relationships, and if you sort of solve for every relationship, it fixes it in a point in space. And if you then think of this massive Sudoku, multidimensional Sudoku puzzle, and you solve for every relationship to every other relationship, you get this rigid structure that represents all of the ways that concepts in a language relate. And the computer figures this out just by reading text, just reading lots and lots of text and trying to predict what word comes next. It figures out this latent representation, the shape that represents a language. And one of the cool things that you realize coming out of this is that meaning isn't encoded in any one word. Meaning is encoded in the relationships of all words to each other. Sort of like the topology, the shape of this shape is what meaning is. Just sort of a deep and cool point. And so now, we have the shape which represents language with dog in a specific spot. And you ask this really interesting question. Does the shape of, say, Spanish and the shape of Japanese, I mean, they have different cultures and different histories and different ways of talking about the world and conceptualizing gender and language. There's just so many different aspects of language that make a language a language. So if you take the shape of English and the shape of Japanese or the shape of Spanish and you sort of rotate them, they couldn't possibly be the same shape. But the 2017 breakthrough was actually they are. And of course, there are words in Japanese that don't exist in English and words in English that don't exist in Japanese. But if you blur your eyes, the overall shapes are pretty much the same. And the point, which is dog, ends up being the same in both. And that's how you can do a translation between languages when you don't have a Rosetta Stone, you don't have any examples of how to translate, when you have two completely unknown human languages. These techniques enable you to translate between them. And I think this is so beautiful and profound in a time of such division that underlying us all and all of our differences is actually this, almost universal human meaning shape that unites us all. Because what is language but a model of the world and how we feel about it? Right? And this works for English and Turkish and Esperanto and Finnish, which is a weird language, and Chinese and Aramaic. And there are definitely differences between the shapes, but they're similar enough that you can translate between them by lining up their shapes. All right, so that's why we're like, okay, it is now time to get going. And since 2017, there have been a whole bunch of follow-up techniques that are a little harder to visualize, that extend this. And honestly, this is not even just research technology. something like this is now sitting behind the scenes when you use a Google Translate, or even honestly now when you search on Google, models like this are being used. So I wanted to take a quick detour into something I think is really beautiful and interesting. I'm going to show you a music video that I made using very related AI techniques. And I'll explain how it works in a second. It'll connect back to the original image um, with actually my partner who's playing this song. So let me play it for you. The thing to know is that this was generated with AI, and it was generated with language. I typed the words, the images that I wanted the computer to generate, and it created this video. Let's see. Maybe I have to hit this again.
Unfamiliar constellations, shadow candy rearrangements. I am dying to be patient while they're watching entertainment. So I'll let go of all that I know. Dead dreams and submarines adrift in the cold, and I'll find home at the end of the road, waiting to see what unfolds. In the redwoods, in the silence, I am empty, I am timeless. In the plenty, I am choking, I am ready to be open. Will you love me in this ocean? If I'm frozen, if I'm broken, will you love me in this ocean? If I'm frozen, if I'm broken, so I'll let go of all that I know. Dead dreams and submarines adrift in the cold, and I'll find home at the end of the road, waiting to see what unfolds. And I'll let go of all that I know. Dead dreams and submarines adrift in the cold, and I'll find home at the end of the road, waiting to see what unfolds.
Okay, so the surprising thing, right, is like no image editing software was used to make this. I didn't find images somewhere else and then put them in. This took around 24 hours to generate. The tech for this has only became available at the very beginning of the year. I made the video just after it was possible. And here's how it was made. Here are the prompts that I typed in to generate this music video. So I'd say like sad and dark night sky with stars and the moon trending on ArtStation for 24 frames. Or you can see down here, Clocks Underwater by Salvador Dali for 24 frames. Or origami graffiti for 24 frames. And what's interesting about this is that it's using very similar technology. This is a kind of translation that works across modality. And it turns out that you can build, just like you can build a shape for language, you can build a shape for images, and you can learn to translate between the two. The way OpenAI did this original version of this technology is called Clip. The new version is called DALL-E. New York Times just did a piece on it, I think, like a week ago. And basically the way it works is that you ask the machine to build a shape that represents images that you've shown it, a shape that represents language. You look at all the different captions, image pairs across the internet that learns to align these two shapes. Although it's not a hard rotation in this case, but it learns to align them. And then you say something in language, it goes into the shape, you rotate it, squish it over into the image shape, and you ask the computer to generate that image, and out comes that music video. And what makes me really excited about this is these kinds of translation techniques aren't just language to language, but they can work across modality. And we don't yet know all the modalities and ways in which animals might speak. And this gives hope that we'll be able to understand something, even if it doesn't look anything like our language. And so, of course, this is the punchline, which is, okay, we now have the tools to build shapes that represent communication systems. Can we build it for animal communication? Most of the work done currently has been on, text, and now you've seen it on images. There's much less work done on audio. And that's one of the things that we are experimenting with, is like, how do you build these shapes directly from raw audio? And then if you can build the shape, and there are a lot of problems on the path to getting there, like animals speak over each other, it's unclear who's speaking. There's a lot of background noise. You have to collect enough data that you can build this shape. But the goal is build the shape that represents elephant communication, humpback communication, beluga communication, crow communication. And then we get to observe it. What properties does it have? And does it fit anywhere into the universal human meaning shape? If it does, that gives us the ability to start to translate directly into the human experience. And, the intuition, at least mine, is that some part of this shape probably overlaps, right? Dolphins look into a mirror and recognize themselves. They have self-awareness, which means that there's a rich interiority to their world. Orcas have culture and dialects, accents, and sometimes the dialects drift so far that they actually can't communicate. They're like separate languages. Other whales are known to carry around their dead and look like they grieve, have family structures, need to eat. There's a lot that's the same about our experience of the world and the other beings of our planet. And so you'd expect there to be some overlap in these shapes, as we have to represent similar concepts in a similar physical world. But also, their worlds are completely different than ours. Humans have been around speaking for what, like 100,000 to 300,000 years? Dolphins and whales have been communicating vocally and passing down culture for 34 million years. Just imagine the kinds of world and worldview that they have that we just do not have access to. And so you'd expect some part of that shape to not overlap. And I still don't know which part is more fascinating. The parts of their experience we can translate directly into human experience via their communication, or the parts that are so different that we can't, and we just have to start asking questions, but that we can see that the structure is there. So one of the things we're really inspired by is Roger and Katie Payne's work. In the late 60s, they worked on this album, The Songs of the Humpback Whale. Which I don't know how many of you in the audience have heard, but it was profound, because it's the first time we as a Western society really heard, the voices, the music, the song of another species. And it was so profound, it arrested and changed culture, right? Go back in time to Save the Whale. Star Trek 4 came out of that record. It goes on Voyager 1 to represent not just humans, but all of Earth on the Golden Record. It was played in front of the General UN Assembly, and I think is the galvanizing artifact for the ban of deep sea whaling. It was a shift in perspective that changed how we humans felt about ourselves and thought about ourselves. And in so doing, it changed our behavior. I think there are these moments that come in movements that can really change things. And that's sort of our hope for Earth species, is that it can help create a moment inside of a movement we already know exists, to make a shift in how we think about ourselves. There was another time that this happened, and it was when there were human beings on the moon. Like when they stepped on the moon, it came in a context, there's already like Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson. and there's a nascent environmental movement, and into this context, we go to the moon, and when there's a human being standing on the moon, what happens? Well, blue marble and Earthrise are still some of the most viewed photos in world history. Sort of all get dosed with the overview effect, and the Clean Air Act is passed. Modern environmental movement is born. Earth Day is founded. NOAA is created. The EPA is born. And this is all in the Nixon era. There are these moments when we get a shift in perspective. We see ourselves from the outside, and things can drastically change. I think about my own moments of personal transformation, and almost always it comes from an act of transformational listening, right? Like, I don't think that we change when we speak. I think we change when we listen. And almost always, right, at least for me, it's happened when somebody's been able to tell me a way that I've been causing harm that I'm often unaware of. And when I can truly listen, that transformatively changes me. And that's, I think, our hope for Earth species, is that it changes who we are by being able to truly hear. So, I want to jump into a little bit of just a little bit more of the specifics of what we do and how we're working. We're really focusing now on data sets for species that have biologgers. So these are devices that scientists put on animals, whether it's whales or corvids or elephants, and they record. They're non-invasive. They record sort of accelerometry data, like how the animals move, how they're oriented. Sometimes they'll have audio, sometimes they'll have video, and they generate mass amounts of data that, as of yet, don't have a great way of being analyzed. Or at least there's a lot that's left on the table. There are the machine learning models that we use to do the analysis. And then there is finally playback experiments, going out into the field and testing out what you have learned. And it creates this sort of cycle. A lot of what we're working on now is, how do you take all of this data and turn it into meaning? You have, say, a humpback whale moving through the water. How do you turn that into what its behaviors are? And then as you work on algorithms like what are its behaviors, how do you benchmark to make sure you're doing well? And how do your algorithms stack up against another group's algorithms? Right now, there aren't a set of standardized benchmarks in sort of bioacoustics and biokinematics to let us know whether we're getting better. So that's another thing we're working on. And then finally, playbacks, and we'll get to that in a second. So I wanted to just play a little bit, like what do these tags look like? This is with one of our partners, Ari Friedlander at UC Santa Cruz, who's one of the pioneers of putting these suction cup tags onto whales, and this is what it looks like. It's down in Antarctica. And some of our work right now is figuring out, how do we take the data coming off of these tags and turn it into, as I was saying, like meaning. What are the behaviors that they're doing? But another problem is, often, even when you have a tag on an animal, the data that's coming in is messy. And let me give an example of this. So I'm curious whether anyone will be able to tell what species this is. hope that wasn't too loud for everyone in the audience. I think this is amazing because like when we think of like whale communication, we normally think of like humpback song, but the ocean is so rich. So this is beluga communication. This is a couple belugas communicating. None of that is digital, right? That's just a hydrophone, which is a microphone that you put underwater. It's just a raw hydrophone placed underwater. That's it. And actually, this goes up to what, like 12 kilohertz. And humans can listen up to 20 kilohertz. Belugas are communicating up to 150 kilohertz. This is essentially an alien modem. And there's the researcher Valeria Vergara, who's been studying beluga communication for 20 years. And in her most recent work, she's showing that belugas have contact calls, that is, individually identifying calls. Humans would just call them names. Dolphins also have names. They're called signature whistles. What's interesting about belugas is that it's a broadband call. So it has a lot of data. It's more like a modem packet than a whistle. And in her most recent papers, she was only able to use 3% of her data because she couldn't tell who was speaking, even though she had a tag on a beluga. Other belugas are coming in and speaking into that tag. There are dozens of them moving around quickly. She can't tell who's speaking, and they also overlap. I just love this as a provocation because, the ocean is 95% unexplored. And for these kinds of studies, like beluga communication is 97% unexplored. And just imagine what's waiting around the corner. And one of the problems that we set out to solve early on was this problem of the cocktail party problem. That is, of multiple animals speaking at the same time. And you want to have the AI separate them out into their own individual tracks so you can analyze them. These new models of AI are giving us unprecedented tools to do what was previously just too computationally intensive. And so this is our first paper. It's just out in Scientific Reports, in Nature Scientific Reports. And it was showing the first end-to-end solution for how to listen to multiple animals and separate them into their own tracks, which is like a prerequisite for what we need. So here is an example. These are two dogs barking. We synthetically mixed two individual dogs, and we've taught the AI how to separate them out again. So here's the two dogs together. And then we separate. What I just think is so cool, because my brain can't really do this. Like, even though the calls, right, the barks are mixed temporally and spectrally, like the AI, because it knows what an individual dog is supposed to sound like, can learn how to separate them. And you're like, okay, it's two dogs and two different species. Maybe it's just using species to figure it out. So here's an example of macaque monkeys. Three of them speaking at once, and then we separate them out. So, one of the things we often think about is, when you're working on sort of a moonshot, or maybe it's better to call it an Earth shot. It's a long journey. There are a lot. This is just a lot of science one has to work on and solve along the path. And when you go to the moon, sometimes you invent things like Velcro, which is a real story. And for us, this is sort of in that world, is as we're working on this sort of larger goal, getting to help work on these foundational technologies. You can imagine that for understanding the health of our, say, rainforests or coral reefs, biodiversity indices are really important. But understanding from just a microphone in the rainforest who's speaking, how many, when, is a hard problem. as we get better at this kind of cocktail party problem source separation, that really helps in these other conservation worlds. This, as I mentioned, this paper is now out in scientific reports. Possibly more importantly, all the code is open source. All the data sets we use to do it are open, and people are already starting to use these open source tools in their own work. So I think this is the part that gets me really excited. All right, so we've talked a little bit about cocktail party problem, about how do you take all of the data coming off of these tags and turning it into meaning. And then we also have playbacks experiments. How do you know when you're right? How do you understand what is perceptually important to a non-human? This clip is from the documentary Fathom. It's one of our partners, Michelle Fournet. So I think this documentary is on Apple TV and talking about her work. So let me play it.
The oldest cultures are not human. They're from the ocean. 40 million years ago, before we walked upright, before we sparked fire, whales evolved to build relationships in the dark.
I'm trying to start a conversation is the most basic way you can say it. I'm trying to put a speaker in the ocean and talk to a whale and hope it talks back.
Starting playback.
If this work is successful, it will be the first experiment where we have engaged in a dialogue with a humpback whale.
I just highly recommend watching that documentary Fathom. The punchline is that it works. Michelle's working on sort of the simplest two-way communication with humpback whales. She's playing hello, like it's a contact call, which for in humpback, it's called a whoop call, and it sounds like whoop. And she calls to the whales, and they call back, like hello, hello, sort of like the hello whale experiment. And one of the things we're really excited by is, right now, often in doing a humpback or really any playback experiment, like biologists are limited to taking the audio that they have, that they record, and either playing it back, speeding it up, or dropping out some frequencies. But that's sort of like just taking our hello and then speeding up hello, or slowing it down hello, but it's not really changing the semantics of it. Like if you really want to have a dialogue, you'd like to be able to generate novel new calls that use the grammar or syntax of whales or whatever species you're working on. And so, we're early on in experiments here, where we can generate novel synthetic animal communication for the intent to work with biologists to do playback. So here's an example. One of these three is real. The other two are generated. Oops. Oh, keeps going, huh? I'm gonna move on. What I think is really interesting about this is that the way this technique works is it breaks calls down into 15 millisecond sort of like microphonemes, and then it creates a grammar over those microphonemes. So it sort of predicts what thing comes next, and it uses that to generate new sound. And again, I bring this up, we're at the beginning of this journey, but to give sort of a tour of some of the tools and fundamental problems that machine learning AI is enabling as we work towards this larger goal of how do we build the shape of a whole animal communication system of a language and then align it and see if we can do a translation. I really think of this moment in history as like these new techniques, right? Our ability to understand the world is limited by our ability to perceive. these new techniques are expanding the aperture of what we can perceive, of how we can listen. And it's almost that these technologies are like the modern invention of optics. Because optics did two things, right? They both gave us both the microscope and the telescope. And the microscope, right, let us peer into, what appeared to be empty water and discover things we didn't even know existed: radiolarans, bacteria, viruses, new species of species appeared because we invented a new tool that let us perceive more. Let us discover the unknown unknowns. But it was also like the invention of the telescope, because the telescope let us look out at the universe. And what did we discover? We looked at the patterns of the cosmos, and we discovered that Earth was not the center. I think these technologies are going to let us look out at the patterns of our Earth and discover that human beings are not the center. And even if we invent the greatest carbon drawing technology tomorrow, which would be fantastic, and we started drawing down all the carbon, it wouldn't solve the core problem, which is human ego. Technology is not good, it's not bad, but it's not neutral. It's easily captured by the perverse incentive systems of a larger society. And we have this choice, right? Like, technology can be used either, like, this more powerful technology gets, it can be used to protect and serve better, and it can also be used to exploit better. So we have these sort of branching paths of what these new technologies enable. And I think it's our collective job to work on bending that arc of technology towards being able to listen, be connected with the world around us, and for shifting our perspective to be, stewards of this incredible, place we call home, that pale blue dot, suspended in as a mote of dust in a beam of light, as Carl Sagan likes to say. So I just want to thank everyone and for the time. This is actually one of my co-founders, Katie Zakarian, Swimming with Hope, a juvenile sperm whale in the Eastern Caribbean. We'd love to have you get involved. You can check out earthspecies.org, which has a link to our GitHub. It has a link to our Discord and community. Come talk to some of our team. We are, as I said, we're a nonprofit. We're collaborative, and we hope to talk to you and see you guys soon.
Amazing, Aza. I have my book here. I've been taking notes. I feel like, well, guess what I thought I would feel like, which is, wow, there's so much here to dig into, and we only have less than 15 minutes to do that in conversation with you. So I hope that means you'll come back and we'll have more opportunities to dig in. But we have questions happening in the Q&A, and I'm going to paraphrase a few of them. But I had similar questions, and maybe I'll start with probably the one that goes to the core of every single person here, which is, how do you think this is going to impact the welfare of animals? Because this is a group that you're talking to that really, we spend a lot of time looking at the very negative things that people can do to animals, and the negative things that humans can do that really significantly impact the ability for animals to experience good welfare and to be happy and self-directed and live their own lives. So in this amazing shift in perspective, as you were talking about, and our ability to perceive more about animals, what do you think this will mean for the welfare of animals?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think this could have, profound implications. In some sense, I wish it wouldn't. Like, I wish we could like observe, like notice our senses. We've all had like profound relationships with like our like home animals, like pets, like dogs, cats. And so it'd be nice if that was just enough. But I think what Earth Species, like what this kind of work and all the other people who are in this field working on it can do, is it can sort of act as this moment of waking us up. And it comes through, I think, an unusual pathway, which is to say, normally, I think we're used to now feeling bad about ourselves as a species, and feeling bad for what we're doing to other animals. And we sort of are motivated by shame or guilt. And I think it's important that we understand the harm that we're doing. And also, I think it's easier for us to especially shift identity level questions when it can come through a different emotion like awe or like wonder. And that's the hope, is that this creates a new pathway for us to change and to wake up. There's a story that comes to mind is, we're really grateful that NPR's Invisibilia did this sort of like documentary on us, and Roger Payne and other people in the field, and Elise Spiegel, who did that piece. At the a couple weeks later, she called me up and was like, "Aza, I hate you." And I'm like, okay, I don't know where this is going. Why, Elise? And she's like, "Well, I hate vegetables." I'm like, okay. And she's like, "I took my entire family vegetarian after doing this piece, and I hate vegetables. Like, what did you do?" And she's like, "I did it because I could hear something I couldn't hear before. It was in the back of my mind, and I became aware of it." I think you could imagine in 50 years, maybe less, the result of this work is that it shifts society so that thinking about like eating meat maybe becomes a lot more like smoking. It's a thing that some people do, but it has this kind of stigma against it because you realize you are like engaging with another being that has mind, has thought, communicates. And when you can see that part of yourself in somebody or something else, I think it changes fundamentally your relationship to it.
Yeah, I wonder, when you were speaking, is what if we don't like what they're saying? What if what they're saying back to us, when we can understand, causes such deep grief that we as humanity don't know how to proceed? And then I guess we proceed in conversation. We proceed in how we've often, as humanity, had to look at some pretty horrible things we do as humans. We've had to proceed in conversation. And so how interesting to think of the council of those who can communicate being so broad and so deep that it could create an entirely new reality, in which animals and their welfare is communicated by themselves, which we talk a lot about, right? The idea that we can't provide animals welfare. We can only provide the conditions in which they can experience and make choices to have welfare. So often we take away those choices in the way that we inhabit the world as humans. And so if they can communicate, then we can create the better conditions. We're called upon to create the better conditions. Fascinating. I'm so fascinated. Yeah, go ahead.
It reminds me of there's the phrase in various activist groups, which is nothing about us without us. And that's a really hard thing to include non-human like beings into. And my hope is that this gives us a conduit for doing that. I do want to say, I also don't think there's going to be a panacea. It's not like there's any one silver bullet, like in this like massive fight for like climate disruption and pollution, our extractive systems. A critique I'll sometimes hear is like, hey, there are groups of human beings that already have language and they're still oppressed. And I think that's absolutely true. But imagine how much worse it would be if they didn't have language at all. And so that's sort of like where we are going here.
Yes, someone commented in the chat about that concept we often use in our movement around being the voice for the voiceless, and not really liking that, and that they're not voiceless. We just don't listen. And so This gives another ability to listen. And so this kind of takes me to the next question that was there, which is, what about, when we strive to understand animals now, we know that they vocalize, but we also know that they use a significant amount of body language and scent, as you were mentioning, sonar, different things to really understand their world. How do you think this could impact all those different modalities of communication?
I love this question, because it is sort of like human centric to think like all of our communication, the most important communication, comes through this channel, which is language. But if you've ever like gone to a country where you don't speak the language, somehow you figure out how to communicate. So there's like communication is a broad spectrum of things. And that's why I was showing that music video, because here is not a translation from one language to another. This is translation from text or like concepts into images. And there's a whole new field that deals with multimodality, where you can translate from one mode to another without needing like labels. You don't have to have a biologist like say this means that. You just run it over lots and lots and lots of data. You can start to learn, say, that this set of movements goes to these sets of vocalizations at a social or group level. Say for like an entire flock of crows. Let's do this kind of cross-modal translation from behavior to sound in social groups. And so our hope is that we can incorporate many different modalities, because indeed we don't know which one's the right one. That said, one of the reasons why the ocean is exciting is because light doesn't travel well underwater, but sound does. And so that forces communication to go through one mode. And so it's such a hard problem that we're looking for all the sort of ways that we can find easier paths in and constrain the problem.
Amazing. Well, I know we're coming to the end. I will come to the end by saying thank you, and you must come back, and we need like hours to talk. But I think the second most popular question here is, what does your organization need most right now? Is it funding? Is it greater awareness of your work? More involvement from individual researchers? What is it that you need to continue to do this really important work?
Oh man, thank you for that question. The things we need. More biology partners. We have an incredible list of people we're really grateful to work with, but folks that have data that want to like work on translating it, we'd love to talk to you. We're a nonprofit, so obviously if this is something that really speaks to you or resonates with you, we would love to have you join our journey. We have like small donors, and we have like large, like more institutional donors. So like all of those things, please come. I really do think there's going to be this like bright line mark of like before we understood what animals were communicating and after, in terms of like how we think of ourselves as a species. And then finally, it's awareness. I think the hope that communication with other beings is possible is part of the transformation. Just having that question out there, and seeing that there's progress being made starts to make the change even before we get to the final answer. So would love help there too.
Thank you so much, Aza. I love closing out on hope. I think it's something that we all need a lot more of. And it encapsulates how I feel coming to the end of this presentation, is that there is hope. There's new frontiers. We can bend the arc of technology towards the positive. And this may really help us advance animal welfare in very, very significant ways. So thank you for taking the time to come and speak to us. Thank you for this amazing work. And I just see this as the beginning. Thank you.
Yeah.
And sadly,
Thank you so very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Sadly, that's all the time we have for this session. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you to everyone who joined us here live, who participated in the chat, who submitted really great questions. I think we were able to capture, the welfare, the different types of modalities, and what do they need, which was just the right blend of questions coming out of this pretty heady presentation. Please take a minute to answer our survey question. All the answers are anonymous. It can be found on the left-hand side of the screen under the navigation menu. and selecting the correct session, of course, comment back on the correct session. We are now going to take a 15-minute take a break with your pet break, sponsored by the Alberta Animal Rescue Cruise Society. This break offers you the opportunity to connect with your fellow attendees by posting a photo of your pet. I don't know if you can see mine. He's sleeping back there. I'll have to see if I can wake him up and get him into a photo. And then you can also like and comment on each other's posts, and you'll find that all in the main menu. After the break, we're going to be splitting into 2 concurrent sessions, which means you'll have to choose to attend one of the 2. On the PetSmart Charities of Canada stage, which is where we are now, we have the future of talent acquisition and retention. And on the Royal Canin stage, we have the using the psychology of prejudice to improve human-animal relations. What amazing content, I have to say. What a great conference. Don't forget that both of these sessions are going to be recorded, and you can access them for 2 months afterwards, which of course you're going to want to. And before I let you go, allow me to give you the play to win code for this session so that you can advance on the leaderboard. The code is animal language, all one word. That's animal language. You can also find it in the chat too. Enjoy your break and see you back for our concurrent sessions in about 15 minutes. Thank you, everyone.